What if I told you that the car that could dominate Formula One in 2026 is already under suspicion before even starting its first engine? What exactly does the FIA know about the MCL40 that has set off internal alarms? Today I tell you everything. Imagine this. You have just won the Constructors' Championship, you lead the current World Championship with your 2 drivers in the top 5, you have developed a car that in simulation surpasses the entire grid, and suddenly, a technical investigation by the FIA threatens to destroy all that advantage before even starting the first engine of your new car. This is not fiction, it is what McLaren could be facing with its long-awaited MCL40 for the 2026 season. But what exactly did the FIA see in Mercedes' designs that also directly affect McLaren? Why in recent weeks are rival engineers lobbying in the corridors of the paddock for the rules to be rewritten? And how exposed is McLaren by having based its entire 2026 aerodynamic and structural package on an engine architecture that could, at any moment, be considered a legal trap? This is not just a technical issue. This is pure politics, engineering war, and a silent power game that can completely change the hierarchy of Formula One. Because when one of the most influential teams in the championship begins to be closely observed by the control bodies, what is at stake is not just an advantage, it is its legitimacy. What you are about to discover has not been said in official statements, but it is spreading like wildfire among journalists, insiders, and technical directors. And the most disturbing thing is this: McLaren may not even be the one who designed the trick, but if the cheat is confirmed, he will be one of the biggest losers. Should the MCL40 be subject to sanctions before debuting? Or is McLaren simply the victim of a technical witch hunt unleashed by rivals who failed to anticipate? Controversy is afoot, and what's behind it could be much bigger than it seems. Stay until the end because we are going to unravel this story like it has never been told. From the secret laboratories of Mercedes to the private FIA meetings where the future of the 2026 regulations is decided. To understand the magnitude of this situation, you first have to travel a little back in time. To 2024, a season that marked McLaren's return to the top of Formula One after decades of frustrations. Not only did the Woking team win the Constructors' Championship for the first time since 1998, but they did so by beating giants like Ferrari and Red Bull, who had dominated the hybrid era for years. Lando Norris emerged as the team's natural leader. With 6 victories and surgical consistency, he was just steps away from the world title. His partner Oscar Piastri was not far behind. Consistent, fast, and mature, he showed that the team's future is in firm hands. But behind those successes on the track, there was a much more ambitious project brewing in silence. While the paddock spotlights were on the racing, McLaren and Mercedes were working hand in hand to develop the next big technical revolution, the powertrain of 2026. A completely redesigned hybrid engine with a power ratio split almost equally between internal combustion and electric. Lighter, more efficient, and designed to operate under a new set of technical standards that sought to reduce environmental impact without compromising speed. In November 2023, McLaren announced an extension of its agreement with Mercedes until 2030. But this was not a simple power unit supply contract. According to insiders, the deal included clauses giving McLaren preferential access to new engine development, exclusive power mapping configurations, and private testing at joint facilities in Germany and Woking. It was, in practice, a semi-factory team without formally being one. During closed simulations, McLaren engineers began to notice something unusual. The data showed power and efficiency figures that were well above standard projections. A performance that was not explained only by the car's aerodynamic design or by a conventional electrical improvement. Something else was happening at the heart of the engine. That something soon became the worst-kept secret in the paddock. An alleged legal loophole in the regulation of the compression ratio. A technical interpretation that could be radically altering the real operating conditions of the engine, and that placed McLaren as a direct customer of that technology in a privileged position. Everything seemed perfectly orchestrated for McLaren to start 2026 with an overwhelming structural advantage. But as always in Formula One, when a team seems to have everything under control, something in the system becomes unbalanced. And this time, the threat does not come from another team, but from the regulators themselves who could decide that this advantage should never have existed. Formula One has always been a game of interpretations. Rules are there to be followed or to be challenged. And that is precisely what is happening with the technical scandal that revolves around Mercedes' 2026 engine, and by extension McLaren's star project, the MCL40. What seemed like a simple technical specification, the compression ratio limited to 16:1, has become the epicenter of a regulatory storm. But before getting into the controversy, we must understand what that ratio really means and why its manipulation, although apparently legal, can completely alter the balance of power on the grid. The compression ratio is a fundamental measurement in any internal combustion engine. It represents the relationship between the total volume of the cylinder when the piston is at the lowest point and the volume when it is at the highest point. The higher this ratio is, the more thermal efficiency the motor has. Translated into the language of the track, more power, better fuel consumption, and greater energy recovery. The regulations for 2026 establish that this ratio cannot exceed 16:1. However, there is one key detail. The measurement is done when the engine is cold, outside of real racing conditions. And that's where genius or trickery comes into play, depending on who you ask about Mercedes' design. McLaren, as a major Mercedes customer, has had early access to this technology. From closed tests on power banks to exclusive simulations with engine maps that have never been shared with Williams or Alpine, other users of the German engine. Some internal sources even talk about custom versions of the hybrid management software, optimized for the specific MCL40 chassis. This has generated tensions within the paddock. Teams such as Ferrari and Audi have begun to directly pressure the FIA to modify the technical verification protocol, demanding that measurements also be carried out in thermal race conditions, and not just in the cold. Because if it is not done, they maintain, a legal vacuum is being allowed that breaks the spirit of the regulation. And this is where the situation becomes delicate for McLaren. If the FIA decides to reinterpret the rule or modify the verification process, the entire structural design of its 2026 car would be shaken. It's not just a question of power. It is the complete packaging, radiator position, mass distribution, power unit integration, internal airflow. Everything is based on that current heat map. If the engine loses that extra compression capacity, the entire balance of the car is compromised. The paradox is brutal. McLaren did not develop the trick. But it could be the biggest victim if the FIA decides to act. Are we facing a masterful act of engineering or a ruse that borders on illegality? To what extent should technical creativity be allowed before sporting equity is broken? These are the questions that keep the paddock in suspense. And while the FIA offices discuss possible amendments, in Woking, tension grows. Because the MCL40 has not yet been born, but its fate is already under judgment. At the center of all this controversy is the FIA. And its position, far from being firm and clear, has oscillated dangerously between inaction, political caution, and a possible against-the-clock review of the engine regulations for 2026. The problem for the Federation is not technical. It is one of legitimacy, precedence, and power. The FIA faces an uncomfortable situation. The gap in the compression ratio regulations is not the fault of the teams that have exploited it. It is the product of ambiguous wording, the result of negotiations between engineers, manufacturers, and technicians of the Federation itself. On paper, the standard indicates that the ratio must be measured at room temperature, without making explicit reference to real operating conditions. An omission that today could cost the credibility of the new regulation. If the FIA decides to ignore the issue, it opens the door for other manufacturers, even those with less development capacity such as Alpine or Audi, to start a late race to replicate the system. But if you decide to act and modify the technical homologation process, you would be retroactively penalizing Mercedes, and consequently McLaren. And that could escalate to an unprecedented legal conflict between teams and the Federation. The first signs of pressure have already appeared. Paddock sources point out that engineers from Ferrari, Audi, and even Honda have brought technical documentation and their own simulations to private meetings with the FIA, demonstrating that the system used by Mercedes could be providing mechanical advantages that go beyond what the spirit of the rules allows. What is being discussed is not whether it is legal, but whether it is fair. The FIA, caught between its need to maintain technical fairness and its responsibility for allowing this vacuum, will have to decide in the coming months. If you correct the error, you will punish those who interpreted it better. Failure to do so will erode confidence in the regulatory system. To this day, the MCL40 remains a promise locked in renders, wind tunnels, and digital simulations. It has not yet taken a single real lap, but its existence has already caused one of the most tense technical crises since the double diffuser era in 2009. What is at stake is monumental because depending on how the FIA acts, we could be facing one of the 3 most radical outcomes in recent years. Leave me in the comments what you think about all this.